something here today, because especially with the theme that's going on over the course of these 5 weeks, we're talking about obviously trying to speak of the Holy Spirit. And today, especially, you can notice something in the built into what's being spoken about is my connection point with Him. Certainly, He's doing everything within His power to connect with me. But that doesn't mean that it's going to go perfectly today. And so I want you to do something. I want you to look to the person next to you, and I want you to tell them, here's the best thing. You're going to do this in like 10 seconds. The best thing that happened to me this week. And then you're going to say another thing. Is this week easier, this Sunday as you walk in, is it easier today to listen for God or harder than it was last week for you? Just make a little heat check. Is it harder or easier for you today than the last time you were in church to hear God speak? So best part of this week, but also this. Turn to the person next to you and talk that up. Best part of this week.
I'll tell everybody, get those. Nobody else on
Question, how many for you today, this is harder than the last time you were, it is harder for me today to connect with God than last time I was here? Raise your hand. So, last week was easier or more difficult than today? Or did you not understand the question? I think sometimes, maybe I'll just give you a little human part of this. Does church blow your mind every time you come? If it does, man, tell me what we're doing, because I don't even know about that. No, not every time you walk in is like the sky's open wide and your spirit's just poured out and you're no, it doesn't happen like that, does it? A lot of times church is like life. It's happening. And the reason why I ask you is because a lot of times I wonder if we really do a little bit of a check. Where am I at? Am I today able to be a part of this experience? I can tell you for sure God is. And you're going to have very willing-hearted people, from the people that welcome you when you walk in, to the people who lead you in worship, to people like me who might get up and talk a little bit. Any given Sunday, you're going to be interacting with people who are very willing-hearted and trying to do their best to bring the kingdom in some small way to every person that walks in the door. It doesn't mean that it always goes like that. And I guess I'm just curious to see it for yourself. Did you check? Have you checked with the Spirit of God? And have you checked with yourself? Are you ready today to hear what may be told you? Because it's good news. That's the thing. I would hate to see somebody miss it just because life's going on. You know what? Some people had a worse week this week than the week before. If that's the case, it may be some things, some cobwebs you got to rip through along with those people. Well, this is the third week we've been talking about the Holy Spirit. And rest assured, the Holy Spirit's here today. He arrived before you. He has prepared himself to interact with you. He's prepared himself to interact with me. And he is busy doing something that's eternal. And so, again, we're all invited into that. Well, the first couple weeks we talked about what he isn't. He isn't a faceless force. Like all he is the energy that runs the place. That is not who he is. He's a person. And he's got as much personhood as Jesus. If Jesus came down and he could find his way onto our platform today, and you would see him physically, he is no more person than the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit just has a different way that he interacts with humans. He's there because he's pulling back the curtain. He's clearing the fog. He's trying to light the way for us, and that's what he's doing. We know that he tries to move us and shake us. We've talked about that over the last couple of weeks. Well, this Sunday we're going to add something to our learning of who he is, and it's very encouraging. It is very comforting to know who he is and the character of what he is doing today. For some of us, to a greater degree than others, just because of where we're at. He is doing something very important and very specific, and it'll be a true comfort. But to explain that, I need to tell you something that some of you may be able to appreciate. When I was in college, cell phones I don't know that they didn't exist. I'm sure the technology was in its first formation, but there weren't networks, and Verizon and AT&T didn't have phones that they were selling when I was in college. And the only thing, obviously didn't have the internet, so there was no texting, there was no FaceTiming, there was no Skyping, there was no Snapchatting. There was, in my college where I was at, we had a payphone on the wall of each floor. Now, where we were at, there was 50 or 60 guys that would all have to share that one phone. That was our portal to the outside world. We were in very rural Wisconsin is where I was in college, added to the fact that it was a Baptist Bible college, so that anything outside those walls they considered very dangerous. So they didn't want any interaction with you and the rest of the world. And so the one thing that we could get news was either from the newspaper or let me talk to people I know outside of this bubble. And so on the end of each hallway, it sat this one phone. And so the one catch with this phone is that, like I said, 50 or 60 guys are sharing this thing. You had to wait your turn to go and beg mom and dad for more money, all right? And you had to do it in front of everybody. You did your long-distance breakups as a community. All right, you're crying, you're weeping, you're gnashing your teeth, all while, the sophomore next to you is like, come on, dude, you're making your 35-cent phone calls for $5 pizzas. All of that stuff happened at that one stupid little payphone. That was our way in. It was our portal to the world and the people that we loved. No one, probably, at the time, would have said that this particular payphone was a satisfying substitute to actually doing the stuff face-to-face. No one would have said this payphone really is the best way to do it all. This is not, very rarely would I see that, but I would say in some ways it was probably better than a substitute. Especially when those phone calls became serious about something really going on, and we actually had to either listen while something was being told us, or we were telling something that's heavy to somebody else. In some ways, it was actually probably better than just merely a substitute. Why? Because in this case, with this dumb little payphone, it made our relationships have to focus on the words. Just ponder that for a second. It also made us ponder and listen very closely for the voice of the person who we're speaking to, and the little nuances that go in the way they breathe. Sometimes even being silent on a phone says a lot, right? You know what I'm talking about. Come on, you know what I'm talking about, right? If you ever had a boyfriend or girlfriend, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of the 5-minute silences said a lot. It's probably why they had that long distance, breakups, but that's a different story, right? We know because we're listening to the emotion in their voice. We're listening to the way they say their words. We had to focus on the words on a level where eye contact, hand gestures, facial expressions, cologne, and perfume had zero level effect. It was literally just the words and the sound of their voice. So in many ways, it was probably better for the relationship that he had to force it into that kind of a world. Articulating our hearts is the most personal, maybe, in this way, because it's forced to be so clear and so intentional. Just as Jesus, I want to give you an example. Just as Jesus was getting ready to be crucified, and he knew it was coming, and he began to prepare his disciples. He was only days away from all this happening, and he was beginning to bridge over to this experience for them. He had told them that not only would he die, they didn't like that, he told them also that he would no longer be with them. He would die on the cross, he would be raised from the dead, and in fact he would go to be with the Father. And they began to pick up that he wasn't just taking guesses at this, he was saying this is the way things were going to go, and they were being upset with that. And he's trying to reassure them, because they're thinking to themselves, what are we going to do? One, we've never seen someone resurrect from the dead like that. Secondly, what are we going to do without you? What are we going to do without the person that we believe is the Christ, the Son of the living God? How are we going to operate life? Because 3 years ago we didn't know about you. Now we know nothing else but you. How are we going to do that? How does life work like that without you? And so he's talking to them about how to prepare themselves for what's getting ready to come. That one's relationship with God, he is saying, one's relationship with God could be very effectual even if we're not face-to-face, which is the world that we've lived in for the last 2,000 years and existed even before Jesus came to the planet. Living in a world where we don't see God face-to-face. You've hung a lot of things up on this world based on the faith of the invisible God. You've made decisions. You've said yeses and nos. You've given money to, you've invested sweat, blood, tears, all these kind of things to someone that you have never ever met. For real. I mean, like you and I would meet. Shake hands. Share dinner. We've never met God face to face. And he's saying that relationship, Jesus is pointing out, who is God in the flesh, seeing these people face to face, he is getting ready to tell them and tell us that it could be just as effectual, if not even more in some ways. Because I'm trusting the voice and the words of God. John chapter 14 is where we begin ourselves today. John chapter 14, we see him in the middle of this, actually in the book of John, it's a bunch of chapters together where he's preparing them for the crucifixion. And he's doing all kind of things and trying to help assure them. And this is one of those particular parts of that encounter. John chapter 14, he says something in verse 15. As they're discouraged about getting ready to let him go, he says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate. Keyword there is another. You've experienced this with me, and what you know of me, the advocate I'm getting ready to send you, the other advocate, is no different than me. He's no less God. He has no less personhood. He's going to be interacting with you in a different way than I have, though. The voice will be the same, the person the same, just not going to be the same exact way. I'm going to have the Father give you another advocate who will never leave you. Verse 17, he is the Holy Spirit who leads us into all truth, which is a bold statement we don't have the time to unpack today. The Spirit will lead you into all truth. The world cannot receive him because it isn't looking for him and it doesn't recognize him. But you know him because he lives with you now and later will be in you. No, I'll not abandon you as orphans. I will come to you. Soon the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Since I live, you will also live. When I am raised to life again, you will know that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. Wow, what? Hold on. Is that like a puzzle or something? Is that a riddle? Or is he just being poetic? What does he mean when he says this? I'm in the Father, you are in me, and I am in you. This is what he's beginning to promise. It sounds like it's poetry because it's so profound. Those who accept my commandments, he says, and obey them, are the ones who love me. And because they love me, my Father will love them, and I will love them, and I will reveal myself to each of them. Now, there is a lot to digest in this passage. 50 sermons attempting to just do this one paragraph would not even anywhere come close to all the things he's trying to tell us here. But this simple thing is that God's followers will have an advocate who is like the person of Jesus, in that he is fully God. An advocate, a helper, someone essentially, if you don't use the word advocate in everyday language very often, it's a person who's going to come alongside you and who will speak on your behalf and mine, who will also counsel us, have a relationship with somebody that's got my back, is basically what this is. A person, an advocate who will always be with us. They'll never abandon us. A person who leads us to understand every possible truth. You know, you say you use, the scientists say that you only use 10% of your brain. You know what I'm talking about? Maybe you're only using 9% of your brain right now. I don't know, but all I can say is I've heard that, right? He is saying it's possible that all truth could be comprehensible and taught. I don't even know how to scratch that surface. A person as well, this advocate who lives inside of believers. A person who reveals his presence and his kingdom to each person who would choose to believe and trust in the death, resurrection, the perfect life, and the life of the kingdom that he is calling us into. A person who would believe in that and follow him into those commandments, into that way of life, he says that person, the Holy Spirit, will come and live inside of them. But interestingly, only doing that particular thing within believers. He will come and live inside the person who will follow him. Jesus says in that same chapter, the world can't receive him because it isn't looking for him. And it doesn't recognize him. It's not to say that God doesn't want to send his Spirit to everyone, because he does. It's an issue not with God, but with their familiarity with him. So just in the same way, there's over 7 billion people on the planet today. And how many ever billions of people have lived before we have lived? And the Holy Spirit has never failed, aside from color, gender, race, nationality, geography, personality. There's not been a person that God's like, you're kind of beyond my borders. He comes to every single person, and he's doing it constantly. But what he is saying is that there are some people whose familiarity with his voice is way off. They've not been intentional. They've not been trying in this way. Their heart is distracted with other things in the world. He's like, it's not that I don't want to connect with you, it's that you're not listening for me, he says. And that's what creates the problem. Because, essentially, they have not been in on the hallway payphone conversations, either with themselves or around people who have. To hear the nuance of his voice, to say the things that he says. He's like, when a person begins to recognize my voice, and then they listen. Unfortunately, in this case, most people, God's talking, all the noise is going on, I'm not paying attention to that, and so consequently, I don't do what he asks me to do. I'm distracted, I got other things going, I have other priorities, other voices that are speaking in my life. It must mean this, that some people accept substitutes for the presence of God. Christians and non-Christians alike must accept substitutes for the presence and the voice of God, or substitute these other voices for his. Now, I can't imagine if God is coming to every person on the planet, has down through history, and will continue until the very last day, the very last breath. He will come to every person. I'm confused how any person, when they come into contact with the divine, God himself, how they would turn him back. Just flatly turn back God's presence, short of thinking that they found God's presence and happiness in other places. You got to ask the same question to yourself: is how is it possible that somebody would not want to be a part of the love of God, experience him? It must be because they've accepted other substitutes as possible fill-ins as to what that could be. Now, in that regard, trying to have placeholder versions of God's work in my life. If you remember the very first Sunday 2 weeks ago, we talked about that first experience that Jesus' followers had in Acts chapter 2. And it says the Holy Spirit came down. There was a handful of disciples there, and the Holy Spirit came down. They had been praying for him. And he showed up. Does anybody remember what were the physical dynamics? Somebody can spit this out. What were the physical dynamics of that first experience of the Holy Spirit? Who knows? What's that? Okay, there was a physical flame over their head, and somebody else said something? They started to speak another, so something happened even within them. Languages they had never studied before, okay? I don't know Chinese, and if this would have happened, I would have been speaking Chinese if there were Chinese people in the crowd. They started speaking the gospel in languages they did not know. There was one other it was the beginning of it. Who remembers what that is? It was the wind. There was a windstorm that rushed through. So there's physical things, in this particular case, miraculous physical things that are going on. In fact, I added to you for that first Sunday is that the name of God, the name of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament is pneuma, which predominantly has this word picture of wind, or the movement of wind, or a windstorm. The most often translated word for pneuma would either be, we call it spirit in English, but it really is, it's the movement of wind. So it's important that you understand that was kind of a beginning. Like, is that how God, wind and fire? So every time you do a bonfire, and I do a really, really good bonfire, by the way. Every time you and I do a bonfire, should I speak into the fire? Lord. I should probably step back, it's too hot, right? Every time the wind blows, oh, it must be the Lord. Is that how it is? If you've ever been in or near a tornado, would you say that it's very holy? You get what I'm saying? We can't just say every time now, for here until the rest of eternity, every time I experience the warmth of my bonfire, or in my home with my fireplace, or every time the wind blows, that's God. No, because God isn't physical like that. He's not nature. He's above nature. He works in and through those things. What we can end up probably doing, and you're going to find out today, how that would be the last thing we should have done if we were a guy named Elijah. Assume that God speaks, that he is in the wind, that he's in the fire. You're going to find this interesting in a story in just a moment. One of God's prophets, this Elijah, was a prophet to a very, very broken people. Okay, Israel was spiritually, religiously, culturally, in every possible way, in a broken down state. And Elijah had been called by God to try and speak into that as one of God's prophets. And he is one of the prophets that stand in high regard, with high respect, across biblical communities. So from the Jewish experience to the Christian experience, people have a high regard for this guy Elijah. But Elijah was a chicken. And ironically, we find him in one particular day, let's just call it a Monday. Elijah is an absolute chicken. He has been running for his life. Ironically enough, one day after he had had one of the world history's greatest mountaintop experiences with God. One day he's on top of the world spiritually. The next day he is an absolute chicken running for his life. And you'll see what God does with him in this great amount of fear. He was being chased on this Monday. Why he was so afraid? He was being chased by a very angry queen, an actual queen of a nation, a woman called, and it's the reason why you don't call your daughters, and none of your grandmas were named, Jezebel. When I was a kid, if you had called a girl a Jezebel, that was fighting words I get from her dad. You don't call your daughters Jezebel for a reason. It's because of this Roseanne Barr-like queen. It's just a real kind of, no class with this woman. See, what had happened is that Elijah had confronted, humiliated, and actually defeated and destroyed both the gods of, the worship places of, and the priests of two gods, Baal and Asherah. These were Jezebel's gods. Those were her places of worship. Those were the priests that she had employed. She was a big fan, Jezebel was, of Baal and Asherah. What's interesting is that Baal was in the Semitic world, in the, for lack of a better description, the Middle East, certainly in that ancient world, Baal, El, was considered the strong male god. So if you're thinking Zeus, in Greek mythology and things like that, El was the ultimate god, but he was the male god. Asherah, interestingly, was his woman. They had all kind of little gods that they produced, but at the end of the day, these two were a thing. They were a couple, Baal and Asherah. Jezebel had hired these 850 different priests to make sure that land and those people always worshiped these two. Well, what we end up having is Elijah goes to say, this ain't right. Because one, Baal and Asherah, they're not real gods. You've made them up. And so he does what most people do in those kind of situations. He says, let's have a contest. And the prophets of Baal and Asherah are like, what do you mean? What are you thinking? Let's have an actual contest. Let's see whose God shows up. So not used to being confronted like this, I'm thinking maybe in the heat of the moment, they're like, okay. And so they say, here's what we'll do. Whoever's God sends down fire from heaven, Baal, Asherah, or Yahweh, whoever's God does that, we'll believe in him. Okay. So for an entire, he says, hey, the mountain's yours. I'm a huge spectator. If your God sends this fire down, Baal or Asherah or both together, I'm following him. So they build this sacrifice, and they're pleading, they're begging, they're on their knees, they're crying out, they're cutting themselves in a cultic way. They're doing everything possible to call down fire from Baal. And all they get is crickets. And in the humorous, the Bible is very, very funny, by the way. And literally, as Elijah's on the sidelines of this particular little contest, when their gods are not sending down fire from heaven, he says, oh, dudes, don't worry about this. Maybe your God is taking a leak. This is what he says to them. Maybe your God is taking a leak. Maybe he's on vacation. This is probably not your fault. I don't know. Step aside. And so he has this sacrifice that's been made, and he says, go get 12 gigantic barrels of water and pour it down. I don't want someone to think that I did a trick. I don't want somebody to think that there's some kind of a fuel in here and I just flip a little thing on and suddenly it gets set aflame. I want everyone to know this thing is doused. It's impossible to light in a human way. They do that. He calls down fire from heaven, says, God, show us your power. And he sends down fire. When the day began with 850 priests of Baal and Asherah, people who had pushed God's people aside, people who had killed the prophets, when the day began with 850 prophets, it ended when it was just Elijah left at the end of the day. Well, flash forward later that evening, guess who finds out that on the mountaintop, 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah had been destroyed and their cult along with them? Jezzy. Cute Jezzy. She says that night, by this time tomorrow, that man is dead. So a man, Elijah, one of the greatest prophets of all history, let alone Israelite history,